Everyone who lives in America has come from somewhere, one way or another. Many people in America see only color and think that America is made up of only white, black, and mixed. They might also think that their family's culture is the only one that matters in the long run. However, there are different layers of history, just as there are different colors of skin, that can tell the story of the person. This is the story, and the his story, of the Russian immigrants' culture that was stirred into America's melting pot. Russian culture is an important part of American history, and an important part of all of us today. On ships heading from Russia to America in the late 1800s, there were disease-filled cabins and terrible living conditions. Most immigrants rode in the lowest class, where it was cramped and unsanitary. Many loved ones were lost at sea. People endured these challenging circumstances because they had a dream to experience America, the land of milk and honey. The terrible living conditions aboard the ship seemed a small price to pay for these freedom-seeking Russian Jews, Russian peasants, Prussians, and many other immigrants that fled Europe during the hard times of the 1800s. Some Russians settled out west, thoroughly taking advantage of the Homestead Act of 1862. This act states that any adult citizen or intended citizen who had never borne arms against the United States government could claim 160 acres of surveyed government land. Others chose to settle down along the East Coast in places like Baltimore because they wanted to stay together and preserve their culture. Baltimore's booming economy and expanding immigrant population gave Russian immigrants a sense of security that resulted from living near their fellow countrymen who had similar traditions and spoke the same language. The location of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad also made it easier and much cheaper for immigrants to access materials for their jobs and families. Russians in Baltimore had an optimistic future, and they were anticipating and achieving their hopes and dreams in their new home in America. Life was very difficult in Russia in the late 1800s under the reign of Alexander III. This included people starving and living in poverty. Many families survived off of bread and water. Russian Jews had it even more difficult because their faith required them to eat a kosher diet. Many families in Russia had to live in sparsely furnished shacks. Sometimes whole families lived together. Under the government of Alexander III, life for many Russian Jews got even worse. He wanted a third of them killed, another third to emigrate, and another third to convert to the Orthodox Church. This process was called the Russification process. There were tight restrictions on these Jews. They couldn't Russify their names, live in eastern Russia, or take jobs in the agricultural field, which was the top earning field at the time. In one interview with the Baltimore Sun, an immigrant says, "Hard times come for the country and everyone starts looking for the scapegoat. Jews, they are the ones who always end up being blamed." Many Russian Jews decided to come to America because of fear and the difficult economic situations they faced in Russia. At these times, Russian victims of these harsh conditions would dream and plan of going to America, a land 4,665 miles away across the Atlantic Ocean. Oftentimes, their plans included sending the oldest man of the family to America to first prepare for the rest of the family to follow. Some families, however, were able to have all of their members travel with them to America. The ship's conditions were terrible, causing many illnesses and deaths of the people on board, including the captain and the crew. When the Russian immigrants encountered Castle Gardens, as all of the immigrants did in the 1800s, they first got a health inspection, or a 6-second physical, as it was known by the immigrants. Ellis Island as we know it did not exist until it opened on January 1st of 1890. During the first phase of the initiation into America, immigrants would get checked by doctors for possible health problems. The doctor might then write an H for heart problems or LCD for loathsome contagious disease on the patient in top. The 6-second checkups were quick, allowing doctors to check many immigrants in short time periods. The second phase of getting into their new home was to answer a series of questions, oftentimes with the help of an interpreter, about potential jobs and living destinations. If immigrants failed either one of these examinations, the immigrant would then go to the Special Board of Inquiry to assess the situation. 10% of immigrants had hearings, and only 2% of immigrants got deported. After all the necessary questioning had taken place, the immigrant would then pay 50 cents per person. This was used as tax to help the Office of Immigration. Russians that settled in Baltimore in the late 1800s were excited about living in a new land that was their home. They took up jobs like sewing, factory working, and office jobs, especially in the period of the 1900s during the World War I. They made garments and other paraphernalia for soldiers. Many Russians settled near other Russians because that made them more comfortable in their new environment. Russian immigrants added to the Russian population in Baltimore. They helped make garments for the soldiers participating in World War I. Because of this, well over 38 million people were clothed during this hard time. There were many provisions required for this time period, including food, clothing, money, cigarettes, and stamps. Rationing was very necessary during these times. Russian immigrants were almost never out of jobs because there was always work involving things like housekeeping, factory work, and transporting supplies to the soldiers. Russian culture has impacted the American culture greatly. American culture has been benefited by Russian culture through music, dance, art, science, and even literature. If you've ever heard the words mammoth, glitch, Sputnik, you've heard words originating from Russia. Russian artwork was collected by people like Marjorie Merriweather of the Hillwood Estate Museum and Gardens, and a portrait of Catherine the Great hangs in her house, which is now a museum in Washington, D.C. Music by artists like Alexander Glazunov created the piece you are hearing now in the background. The famous dance The Nutcracker was created in Russia by Tchaikovsky. It then came to New York in 1944. Even now, this ballet is presented as a Christmas tradition in many American cities for many American families. In the historical fiction book Dreams in the Golden Country by Catherine Lasky, it tells of Russian immigrants and their travels to New York. In the story, the father buys the mother a sewing machine, which she used to sew clothes for her family. In the beginning of the story, she refused to have anything that was American for fear of losing her culture. While this exact example is a figment of Lasky's imagination, many immigrants may have experienced similar scenarios. Russian immigrants encountered many hardships when coming to America, like the tests and physical examinations they experienced when first arriving at Castle Gardens. They also had many hardships leaving Russia itself, including persecution and even execution. They came to explore a new life in a land where they hoped there would be no persecution because of their religion. Russian immigrants wanted to explore their new home without being judged first, again because of their religion, but also because of their culture. Rights were important to these immigrants because they didn't have very many back in Russia that helped Jews and immigrants of Russia, including the Germans. These immigrants are important to American culture because by adding their culture to our melting pot, they're getting a chance to experience the American dream, and we are getting a chance to exchange cultures with so rich a people. We may take for granted many of the things these people have provided for us, but in turn, we provided for them a home and a purpose. Russian immigrants came to the land of milk and honey, and now we welcome them.